can't just be a give and take. It can't just be something where tech wants this, populist right wants this. We both give half of what we want, and we come up with something that's compatible, and we're basically two different pillars of the coalition that are going to constantly be in tension. What you really need is you need a heroic vision for both of those. You need something that is actually, you need something where the core constituency, the populist right, recognizes they're actually playing a key role in this tech positive vision. They're not just being sort of bought off or whatever, given the right sort of political concessions, but they're actually playing a key role in realizing this future. Likewise, the tech elites are, they are going to be, and this is, I think, the key point, the tech elites are going to be leaders. They're going to be political leaders in the country. I don't think they like to embrace this role in many cases. In many cases, they've tried to avoid politics. They get in by necessity. But if you have the level of power that comes with controlling, let's say, a platform like Facebook, you are effectively one of the governing elites of the country.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Nick Solheim, and I'm the CEO of American Moment, and I'm very glad to have you back with us for another episode this week. This week, we are very happy to welcome a longtime friend, Nate Fischer, who is the CEO of New Founding, which is a great venture firm based down in Dallas, Texas. Nate was one of our earliest advocates here at American Moment, so we're always really excited to have him on the show, to have him lecture to our programming about the venture ecosystem and so on. We had a great episode today talking about AI and all the implications therein. It's always fascinating to learn from Nate. He's much more of an expert on these sorts of things than I am. So I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's one of the best episodes that we've done in a while. So we will go now to Nate Fischer. Nate, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
It is great to be back here.
So it has been, I think, a number of years since we've had you on the show, and obviously our listeners who are very attuned to the Twitter sphere have seen your stuff. They're also, I think a lot of them are friends with many of your employees as well, who also have very robust online presences. But for the uninitiated, people who have not been paying attention to, you or New Founding, give the story of how you got here.
Absolutely. So it's interesting because it begins around the same time that American Moment began. As I was in the early stages of developing New Founding, I remember talking to Sarab and hearing about the concept and hearing about a lot of parallels between what was fundamentally a bet on people and credentialing and trust, and this idea that in a world where the legacy elite was sort of widely, in many ways had widely gone crazy, had just widely embraced ideologies or ideas that were totally contrary to our view, there was a need and opportunity for an organization that served as a rallying point for new people. So got a quick background on me. I grew up in New York. I started my career in real estate in Florida doing opportunistic investing. I was always interested in politics, but I saw investing as an opportunity to really take an outside the box approach, whereas politics at the time was a place that seemed to reward sort of Mitt Romney style careerists. So I always wanted to be in a place where a non-consensus but correct idea could matter. So I started investing. I bought a lot of real estate in 2010 to 2014, a lot of distressed real estate. That did very well, built a business around that. I spent a year outside of the country. So really visiting 65 countries, gaining a real pattern recognition of low trust and high trust societies. San Francisco for 2 years, working in technology, and then moved to Dallas. So starting in 2018, I was in Dallas and really starting to think about what are the next major macro themes. The real estate one had sort of played out. I didn't want to just continue just chasing it for the sake of buying for the sake of buying. I really wanted to think about what is the next theme that is going to be a sort of generational opportunity and in many cases generational need, and came back to this intersection of came back to the world of politics and realized that my thesis about politics in the early years that consensus players were the ones who were rewarded and non-consensus people were starting to decide is no longer true. And that is now, we are now in a world where the non-consensus people are the ones who are reshaping the political world. So that, it's a little bit of background, but it kind of leads to New Founding, which originally was probably mainly just a directional bet on the opportunity to put out a vision. There was a non-consensus vision at the time, very, very non-consensus in the world of venture, and sort of and talk about an ability to shape a future that people would be attracted to that was very different from the dominant values in Silicon Valley. And by talking about that, by servicing a rallying point, we'd have people come to us and we would be able to start making productive connections among those people. Ultimately, venture and startups generally are more than anything a business of people. And so just as you started serving as a rallying point for people who wanted a different direction for the country, specifically in DC and in the political world, our goal was to serve as a similar rallying point for people with skills, capabilities, networks in business and particularly venture, and direct them and provide opportunities for them to feel like they could get up and actually shape the country in a direction that they would feel like. So that's sort of the background on New Founding. I could get into sort of what we're doing now, and really it evolved over a few years, but there's about 3 or 4 lines of business that have really developed over the last couple of years.
Yeah, before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit more about, I actually didn't know this about you, that you had spent a year visiting 65 countries. Can you talk more about that? I legitimately did not know this about you.
So that was it was an interesting, I was married. I am married. I have 5 kids now. At the time, I had one kid who was about to turn 6 months. Turned 6 months the day we landed in the Philippines, and we began. And so basically, I, as well as the co-founder of the real estate company, had basically exited the day-to-day there and knew we wanted a global perspective. We knew, in some sense, based on where we were with the family stage and things, it was still possible to travel. Really, traveling with a 6-month-old is not that difficult. It impedes your evening activities a little bit, but it's not logistically. They're pretty accommodating in many ways.
Yeah.
And so we decided we wanted a global perspective. Real estate gives you a really deep sort of local view of a particular, very sort of local parochial, you could say. I would say best thing we figured we could get was just hit up a lot of people. So largely hit up Harvard alumni just through the Harvard Alumni Network, and ended up being mostly HBS. And I went to HLS, but mostly was Harvard Business School people, and would visit a country. In some cases, it was quick, as we're in one morning. We do we come in the evening. We do, let's say, 6 meetings with people where we just hit people up and we just say, hey, what are the opportunities you see? What are the challenges you see? What are are there any particular business opportunities where investors looking at exploring opportunities, and just getting a sense of industries that work in high trust societies, industries that work for foreigners, industries that require deep political connections, industries that are sort of being changed by technology in different ways in different countries. Then we would typically go the next day and, let's say, do a half-day tour of the city, which is an opportunity to ask the tour guide politically incorrect questions like, what do you think of the Chinese would be a common one. You get sort of interesting answers, or hearing scuttlebutt on the street. Often I learned that there's a lot of things that Harvard Business School crowd is not talking about that actually become major national news within a few months. So chance to really see sort of cultural differences, political differences, correlate business opportunities. And I think that really helped. What actually ended up playing out more than I appreciated was it really allows me to sort of see what layers of what societies look like with different levels of political institutions. So as political institutions degrade in America, understand actually what does that look like? How does business need to respond as societal trust declines? Okay, here's what a very high trust society looks like. Here's what a medium high trust society looks like. Here's what a moderate trust society looks like. So I think there were a lot of analogs. And then really, I think the third one was sort of seeing how technology is actually, this was what really struck me. This is why we moved to San Francisco, why we went to technology, was realizing technology is profoundly shaping this. And technology is also a means to, in many ways, actually project governance and trust. So a good example is in South Africa. The government cannot keep you safe in a taxi cab.
Right.
But Uber was able to project good enough governance into South Africa that you could get into an Uber and feel secure they're not going to take you around the corner and mug you. And that's a major change and ultimately one of the factors that is fundamentally shaping what it's like to live in a particular country.
Yeah, that's all very interesting. So tell us about the 3 or 4 different verticals that New Founding is operating in right now.
Yep. So fundamentally, I say we're a venture firm, but we're a venture firm in a broad sense. Originally, we were actually slow to move into classic venture capital, but we were always focused on, I would say, the fundamental question of venture, which is and startups and entrepreneurship, which is what founders do, which is envision a future that doesn't yet exist and will it into existence. In many ways, I think venture serves as this anchor to define and then realize a particular positive vision. And I guess going back to a little bit about why I saw a huge opportunity in venture, I realized the right fundamentally was deeply, deeply hungry for positive vision. There were a lot of critiques. I would say in many ways it had been a movement that almost rejected the idea of a positive vision. It sort of limited itself to a conservatism of conserving the good things of the past. But there was a hunger for positive vision, which we very much saw in Silicon Valley back in the teens, as it embraced essentially a political, quasi-political framing for most of their startups. But the right still lacked positive vision. I would say MAGA directionally is embracing a positive vision for the first time. It's make America great. It's not just not just stand athwart history and say no, right?
Right.
But it still didn't get into a ton of fleshing out what that looked like. And fundamentally, I think on the right, we don't necessarily believe that's even always the job of government. I mean, ultimately, we're not trying to just come up with a straight up Red New Deal as the counterpart to the Green New Deal or whatever. It is something where I think private sector entrepreneurs will play a larger role. Obviously, it's not totally binary. And so what we end up doing is we end up starting a couple of ventures. We were involved directly in starting the first major one. We started a venture fund, and I'll get a little bit into that. We just did a first close on another venture fund. So we have a unit where we do venture capital investing, but we also started Ridge Runner, which a colleague, Josh Abatoy, is running. He had been a partner in New Founding, and we talked for years about this opportunity for new cities and new towns. And we saw an opportunity arise, and Josh moved to Tennessee. It's about an hour and a half northeast of Tennessee. We now own about 3,000 acres, and we're really building a community that is both modeling an elevated rural way of life. I think over 100 households have actually bought in there now, and really modeling what a sort of high trust, high alignment community can look like too. So it's a community that really was attracting people who wanted a particular way of life, who believed in a particular vision of community, and were attracted to that rural setting. And that's been very successful over the last few years, really gained significant traction, kind of at the forefront of what elevated rural development looks like. So you can think of that as a venture approach to real estate. We essentially started a real estate development company that reflected that built on a major cultural political theme that we saw, which was both the migration to red states, significant migration to red states. But I would say even the bigger ones are in this age, especially of remote work, but also in the post-COVID cultural context, people really want they don't just choose to live in a place where there's a job opportunity and lower taxes. They want to choose a place where there's a real cultural alignment. That becomes a major factor. Like who you live around becomes a significant, in a lower trust society, a higher trust community is a premium product that people will actually go out of their way, potentially move across the country for. And so recognizing and how do we then build something that satisfies this growing cultural hunger was one. So we started that company. We got involved in starting a company called Volus, very opportunistically, but ended up starting a company called Volus, which does AI-enabled data and AI-enabled transformation, initially in the infrastructure, construction, and mining space. And that is now a Palantir implementation partner. It's now growing in that space, and it's really in many ways, it helped me see the opportunity to transform these old world industrial industries with these new technologies and really appreciate that there's a major, major opportunity across the economy there. So we start a couple of these ones, and then we started scaling up our venture investment. So we just raised first close of a new venture fund, which will be an accelerator focus. So as we thought about it, we realized we are a magnet for founders who are really focused on anything that fits within the theme of American revitalization. So fundamentally, what is New Founding? It's a venture firm for American revitalization. And you have a growing array of the best founders, the most ambitious founders who want to solve something bigger than just a calendar app or another consumer app. They really want to solve something that feels like a civilizational problem. We become a magnet for people like that. And kind of our real success in many cases was working with people at the very earliest stages, like the companies we incubated. And so our accelerator model is a model that institutionalize this ability to serve as a platform for people at the earliest stages as they are building a company and trying to lever our resources, the connections, the local government connections, the national connections, the understanding of these movements. So that's growing. And then kind of the last one that I think is relevant to the topic that we'll talk about today is a new platform we're building, which is, we're calling it transformative buyout. And the idea is basically I would say a successor to the private equity model, where we will buy middle market industrial businesses and steward transformation, steward data and AI enabled transformation. And I think the key word there is steward, and that what I see as the key opportunity is to do this at the ownership level. So when you have a lot of people who are sort of pushing transformation, but ultimately when you're transforming a business, that is a very significant thing. And I think that the current ownership class, private equity in particular, doesn't have the capabilities to actually envision what a transformation looks like in many cases. Certainly not a transformation that I think realizes the potential that is latent in many of these companies. The human potential that I think is key to a successful, real harnessing of this technology that maximizes its capacity, which we'll get to a theme later. And so I think our ability to actually bring that to the ownership level and essentially lean into what the needs are today, which is very different than what they were. I would say the last sort of private equity for the last 30 years was a financial engineering driven reorganization model. And they've kind of reached the end of the line there. And the next wave will be defined by the ability to actually add value to these companies, particularly by leveraging technology. So this last platform is one that it's sort of just emerging now.
I want to tie in some of what you were talking about with the Ridge Runner community with something that you've written and talked about a lot, which is this exit to disrupt theory. My only concern with something like that is, is it retreatism? Is it some version of the Benedict option? Like, what is the difference between exiting to disrupt versus giving up?
I think it's a good question. And I would say I think conservatives have a long history and a long challenge with essentially exiting to retreat, exiting to just sort of move on, right? But an institution becomes liberal, so 20% of the people leave and they create a new institution. Or even if 60% of the people leave and create a new institution, you lose that institutional capital. What I think struck me and why that mindset was so foreign in many ways was Silicon Valley has a very different approach. Their approach is you exit, but you exit with a very clear vision to how we can harness some sort of new advantages, in particular new technologies, to fundamentally reshape the place. So you have sort of different models. You can work within the institution. You can sort of accept it as it is. Most people just sort of complacently go along, right? You can try to work within the institution to change it. But I think another option is you can obviously sort of exit and just sort of build your own little Benedict option or whatever. But I think that the option that Silicon Valley has historically embraced is we're going to exit and we're going to harness something new that sets us on a trajectory or gives us the opportunity to potentially disrupt the entire organization. Whether that means you're displacing it and replacing it, or the alternative is you exit, you build a new technology, and that new technology is going to sort of reshape the rules in the game that is actually going to force the legacy institutions to adjust how they do business. Either way, the ambition in some sense, it's one of the highest ambition level things. It's recognizing that we want to do more than might even be possible within this organization. Or I would say the other side of things is we want to do things, we want to do it in a way where we have tailwinds instead of headwinds. So the example I give is, I think for many people working within legacy institutions, for sort of ambitious young men, let's say, it's just going to be miserable working within that organization. I think that there's a need for it. There's some people who are temperamentally suited to it. They have the skills. They're well suited to the moment. There's some particular advantage. But in many cases, working with a legacy institution, you're just dealing with constant headwinds. You're dealing with constant rules that are sort of impeding your ability, particularly, I think, for more entrepreneurial guys. And that's just it's not a fun way to operate. And it's not a way where you expect to get sort of the highest returns on your effort. So the point of sort of exiting and, say, forming a startup that is going to try to advance a different vision, ultimately envision a different future, and then how do you sort of will it into existence, is you may be doing so in an environment where you've changed the rules of the game. You're operating in a context where, yes, there's enormous numbers of challenges for startups, but for certain people, you can just sort of wake up, seize the day, and just solve some of those. And it's often totally inside of your control. And so that, I think, for certain types of very high agency people, that ability to have their destiny and their control in a much higher degree and sort of eliminate a lot of those headwinds actually gives them the ability to have a lot more impact on changing the future.
What's a really good example of that?
I mean, I think the classic would be, are you thinking startup world particularly?
Yeah.
I think the classic would be, one example is Salesforce and Benioff and how he came up with this idea of SaaS as a disruptor of legacy software. And he sort of, he left I believe he left Oracle, but he left a legacy software provider, which obviously he had a new vision for how he would do things, and went out and explicitly and formed a new company where they almost explicitly declared war on the old model as a way of rallying people, and ended up building a new way of delivering software that ended up changing many, many of the legacy providers, but also built a multi-$100 billion company. Not necessarily someone whose politics we embrace or anything, but just in terms of like an ability to get things done. Great example of a disruptive startup. But I would say Uber is another example, right? Instead of trying to reform the taxi cab industry or something, or figure out how to sort of operate within the existing. I mean, they could have bought a black car provider and gradually trying to change the rules. Instead, they start a startup, and the startup in many ways bypasses a lot of, it either finds regulatory hacks. In some cases, it may have gone a step beyond that, but they ultimately end up delivering a far superior product, scaling much, much faster than would have been possible within the legacy system. And ultimately, the rules had to bend to, it was clearly superior. They had the tailwinds of being able to satisfy unmet consumer demand in a space where the status quo was bad, and the rules had to bend to accommodate them.
Yeah, I think those are both great examples. I want to spend this like middle chunk of the episode here talking about the sort of coalition, the winning coalition that we have right now. You know, you have the more, I would say, like traditional conservative right, and not traditional in the sense of like they're neocons, but we're like cultural conservatives and so on and so forth. And then you have this new addition of people in tech. You have Elon Musk, you have David Sachs, you've got all of these people who have gotten very involved in conservative politics. I went to the American Dynamism Summit last year, put on by A16Z, and the vice president actually gave a great speech on this particular topic, like why it was important to keep this coalition together and why he actually thought it was a winning coalition that could stand the test of time, and that we had a lot more in common than onlookers from the outside would think. I think the easiest place to start with you sort of putting your framework together on this is one of the earliest fractures that we saw in this was before the president was even inaugurated, the infamous H-1B debate on Christmas Eve 2024. Everybody remembers when it was. What did you take away from that debate that raged from Christmas Eve to the inauguration itself.
So that was a wild. I think that was an indication. So really, the dynamic here, I think, and to back up a little bit, sort of about the tech dynamic. There's certainly common interests, but tech. When I started New Founding fundamentally was an outside bet on this convergence of technology and venture and the political right. The Silicon Valley was not a friendly place. Silicon Valley was in many ways seen as sort of the bastion of woke. It was the big tech platforms had just deplatformed Trump, the sitting president of the United States at the time, and Silicon Valley was a center of censorship and deplatforming for sort of anyone with our views. And so this idea that tech would be part of the right, I think, was not a significant idea. And initially, it was sort of a very, very limited number of players who were seen as aligned with that. My bet was actually this can solve a critical need in the country, a critical need for the movement. But also, we need people on the right who are harnessing this technology because it will shape the future. It will shape the world, whether we want it to or not. So the people who wield this, an example I've used is gunpowder, right? People who knew how to use gunpowder during the 1500s were going to shape the future, whether you liked it or not. And so we needed to be part of the group doing that. But the mood on the right was extremely negative toward tech. The mood in tech was extremely negative toward the right, probably even more so. And so what was really interesting was sort of Trump was able to bring them together during the sort of there were groups in tech that started peeling off. Obviously, Thiel had always been on the other side of that, and a few people in his orbit. David Sachs was always on the other side of that.
Yeah, well, and Andreessen too is a good
I was going to say Andreessen started.
Yeah.
Andreessen sort of moved. I think Andreessen talked about how he moved, but he moved early. He recognized some of these themes like reindustrialization and American dynamism, sort of in the very early, around the same time that we're starting New Founding, and so starts doing things that are certainly politically aligned with this MAGA vision. So there were groups that recognized that there was an opportunity and a need that tech could play in solving some of these critical American problems. There was also, I think, a widespread recognition that Biden was destroying the country and would destroy the conditions that would allow tech to succeed. And that, I think, drove a much more that drove a very significant movement in 2024. But in many ways, like that was tech recognizing he's gone too far, right? It was how it was seen widely. It was seen as sort of the Dems have gone too far. It wasn't. I think the right was always suspicious. Many on the right were always suspicious that do these people actually share what we care about, or are they just upset that the people that they've dutifully supported for 15 years just took it a little bit too far, and so now they want to pull us back to where the Dems were in 2013 or 2015, right? And before they went crazy woke. And so I think that there was an uneasy, there was a lot of support. There was a lot of enthusiasm for Trump. There was a lot of on the part of tech, but I think there was always this sort of lingering sense that are these really our people or not? Obviously, that spilled over in the H-1B debate, where it was very clear that one of the central questions, which is sort of the cultural makeup of our country. And I think what's interesting about that is H-1B touches on not just jobs, but in many ways touches on sort of the cultural identity of our elites, this was about people who are going to be playing an outsized role in shaping the culture of our country. And it seemed like many in tech were on a very different side there. And so it was a sharp debate. And what really illustrated, I think, was very clear was this was a alliance that Trump had been able to hold together. It was a political coalition that was held together around a very, very particular threat that was sort of an acute threat posed by the Dems. But we did not have a comprehensive vision for what a alliance would actually be sort of mutually striving toward. Like there was not enough of a vision that these people felt like they were working toward the same thing. For many of them, it felt like they were actually, I think for many, it felt like they wanted very, very different visions for the country. Many in the sort of traditional populist right, the MAGA right, were suspicious that the tech people really wanted what was still a very transhuman division for the country, something that was still very, very incompatible with a sort of embrace of America's cultural heritage. And it bubbled over in this H-1B debate, but I think that was really illustrative of fractures that are sort of deep questions over a vision for the country.
Yeah, marriages of convenience normally do not last. Do you think there is any way that we could build a lasting coalition around a shared vision and set of goals?
So I think absolutely, and that in many ways was well. I'll clarify that. There is absolutely, and there must be a place for a tech positive uh, future for the right. So
Yeah.
without question, the right. I am very confident there can be a positive vision for technology in a right aligned vision for the country. I think that uh, I think that I actually believe that there is a way to do so in a way that brings a good share of the people in Silicon Valley into that they could embrace, that many of them may actually be happy to embrace, and that gives a positive role for them. Obviously, it's not necessarily clear who all will come over. It doesn't mean that everyone certainly not everyone in Silicon Valley will come over. Not everyone who might consider themselves sort of right leaning in Silicon Valley come over. I think one of the most important things is you're also seeing sort of rising new classes of people on the right, and Silicon Valley has rising new classes of people in many cases who are sort of much, much more bought into this. A lot of the same sort of people we're working with. So without question, uh, I am confident that there is the potential for a vision that can really unite both of those. But kind of going to your point about marriages of convenience, it can't just be a give and take. It can't just be something where tech wants this, populist right wants this. We both give half of what we want, and we come up with something that's compatible, and we're basically two different pillars of the coalition that are going to constantly be in tension. What you really need is you need a heroic vision for both of those. You need something that is actually you need something where the core constituency, the populist right, recognizes they're actually playing a key role in this tech positive vision. They're not just being sort of bought off or whatever, given the right sort of political concessions, but they're actually playing a key role in realizing this future. Likewise, the tech elites are they are going to be, and this is, I think, the key point. The tech elites are going to be leaders. They're going to be political leaders in the country. I don't think they like to embrace this role in many cases. In many cases, they've tried to avoid politics. They get in by necessity. But if you have the level of power that comes with controlling, let's say, a platform like Facebook, you are effectively one of the governing elites of the country. And if you're one of the governing elites of the country, if you're going to be accepted as one, if you're going to be accepted as a member of the coalition with the level of power that comes with, then that really only works when the vision that you're working toward is closely united with the vision that the other members of the coalition are looking toward. And I believe that's possible. And I believe that we can offer that. I don't think that that has been well developed yet. I would say there's some attempts. I mean, Karp in his book, Alex Karp, Palantir in his book, sort of tried to lay out, I think, directionally something there. I think there's some interesting critiques of that. There was a critique by Tanner Greer in American Affairs. I think was a pretty good critique of what was missing, and in many ways, what I am sort of a central theme that I believe we have to offer is a more substantive vision for what that sort of shared vision that brings together these groups can look like.
Yeah, let me give you my heuristic for this. And for who belongs in the coalition, being myself a non-tech guy, like I never worked in Silicon Valley or anything like that. So as a, MAGA person, as a social conservative, so on and so forth, my heuristic for trusting tech people, folks from Silicon Valley and so on, is a willingness to put skin in the game. So I'll give 3 examples of this. Like Elon is the really obvious one, right? Not only did he buy Twitter, but also expended a lot of personal, political, and financial capital to get the president elected, right? That is a real, like, he actually put skin in the game. I think Andreessen is another really good example of this. Like, I'm sure he lost business opportunities for supporting the president. And what's more, like, he came down to transition and was like interviewing people for roles in the administration. Like he could have been out there making money and actually like personally made the sacrifice to potentially lose business and also spend time away from his business to make sure that we got a good set of folks in the administration. And then I think David Sachs is probably the best example. Like my understanding of his sort of entree to politics was being one of the most outspoken opponents of giving aid to Ukraine, like 2 weeks after the invasion. And I know for a fact that he lost a lot of friends, a lot of business opportunities, and so forth because of that. So I am, despite the fact that I may have disagreements, whether personal or philosophical or about the conservative movement with any of those three, I'm willing to give them a lot of grace on that because they've actually put skin in the game to help us win. I'm curious to hear if you've got any thoughts about that heuristic, any way that you would tweak it or whatever.
So I think that I'll flesh that out a little bit. I think skin in the game is absolutely the right question, because I would say the pervasive doubt you see on the populist right, and you see this with guys like Bannon, and you see this with a lot of people who are sort of leaders in that space, is that it's a grift, right? They're glomming onto MAGA. They see MAGA is gaining traction, and their goal is basically to glom on so they can get sort of huge amounts of defense money funneled into their businesses and things. And so that's not right. In that case, that's not skin in the game. I mean, you could spend a lot of time in DC helping at the Pentagon so that you help make sure you get money. Right?
And there are some cases where that is true.
Yeah. And I was going to say, like, that's not necessarily that's a common pattern in business, right? You see a political movement and political leaders will glom on and they'll embrace, but they're not actually going to try to advance it. So that's the critique. I would say one of the most telling forms of skin in the game is not even just the time spent, but it's when they jumped in. It's their willingness to do so when the outcome was unclear, right? So with Elon, it's not just a matter of he gave a few $100 million. That's meaningful, but Elon has a lot of money. The real fact is, had they lost, there's a very good chance the Dems would have essentially taken everything he has from him.
Yeah.
I mean, or worse, right? Thrown him in jail. So I think that, are you taking risks when the outcome is unclear? Are they really taking, is there that is real skin in the game. And I think that all of the guys you named were out there at a point where it was still risky and costly to be involved in this.
Yep.
And that is skin in the game of the sort that only grows in these sort of lower trust, higher conflict situations. And that was what I saw very clearly around the world, right? I mean, political calculations by businessmen could be a significant factor in whether they go to jail or something. So I think that's one. I would say the other factor, and this is, I think, the point is there could still be very different visions though, right? I think the question is still, well, do they have skin in the game, but are they essentially entering politics to be prospective sort of leaders in this movement, but to steer the movement in a direction that is it compatible with a vision is it primarily to sort of achieve some sort of transhumanist vision or something? Or is it, which they may sincerely believe in, they may take significant risks for, right? Elon wants nothing more than to go to Mars, let's say. Well, he's going to go all in to make that happen. He'll take political risks, but that doesn't necessarily make him truly aligned with what, say, the populist right, which cares about American culture and heritage and the American people want.
Well, we should make Mars American.
Yeah,
that's the answer.
I think it's a good start. And I would say, I think the other question though is like, is there alignment around vision? I would say that's something that's still like, I don't think that necessarily, I think a lot of the people in tech getting into politics are just starting to get into politics. I don't think they necessarily have a clear and certainly fixed vision of what they're aiming for. Just like I think a lot of the populist right knows directionally what they want, but tech is changing the world and they don't necessarily know what a world reshaped by technology fully looks like that's compatible with their vision. So I think the job, the sort of statesman role here is to actually help bring both, is to sort of help develop something, is to help advance a vision that both of those groups can get behind and can fully embrace. And that I think is the second question. And there may be some intractable divides in some cases, but I actually believe there's the possibility for a very, very strong alliance around something.
Yeah, I think that is all great. And I totally agree with you. And I want to kind of zoom in on, I think, one of the places where there's the most conflict, but also where people know directionally what they want, but they in terms of actually implementing it, they probably know the least. over any other issue, which is all the AI stuff.
Yep.
So we are recording this the day after Jack Dorsey laid off half of his employees, right? There was a lot of consternation, but then also people saying that this is totally overblown. Like, as we know from Twitter, he had a bloated staff anyway, so on and so forth. Like, what do you think? And I kind of want to divvy this up a little bit. Like, let's start with this sort of managerial class, which conservatives and tech leaders alike, I think conservative tech leaders alike, don't really have an affinity for, right? Like, we're not huge fans of these people. They generally tend to be on the left. They are more bureaucratic and so on. But what is AI going to do to them?
AI may not be their friend. I think I like to say AI will not replace people, but AI will replace bureaucrats.
Yep.
And many people in those managerial jobs are fundamentally, they're information processors, they're bureaucrats. They're doing things that in a sense, they've an element of bureaucracy, I think, is it's a very rules-based system that in many ways is designed to strip away elements of your human judgment. You're making decisions, you're administering things according to policy rather than exercising your judgment. Actually, I've talked separately about how I think that let's say anti-nepotism is an example of actually stripping away what would be very human ways of making decisions to make you make it in a sort of objective, technocratic way. Well, computers can do that even better than you can in many cases. So if that's your job, if your job is to administer things objectively, an algorithm is going to do that. I would say at the same time that those middle management roles include a wide array of things, and some of those things are actually going to seize tremendous leverage from technology. But I think that by and large, you're right that a lot of the managerial jobs are going to be replaced by AI. That is going to be profoundly disruptive, and it's going to be more than anything disruptive to the incumbent system, to the incumbent legacy regime.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of the I want to talk more about some of the blue collar job stuff in a minute. But one thing that I've kind of been thinking about, I actually had a conversation with my wife about this the other day. Like, I can fully understand the impulse to, the motivations for if millions of people in a blue collar industry are replaced, like for them to rise up and overthrow you, right?
Yeah.
Are people who are in these managerial roles making 150 grand a year, but they also have 150 grand in student loans and so on and so forth. Do you think that they are capable of the same thing?
I mean, I would say in many ways, more revolutions may have been driven by disaffected elites than disaffected workers, actually. So,
can you say more about that?
Well, I think that you look at the history of, you look at the sort of animating force behind many of those, and there's a lot of theories around surplus elites, around competition of elites and things, and sort of people with education, people with an ability to organize, people with the skills associated with those sort of managerial and professional abilities are certainly the ones who are able to sort of develop the ideologies that lead to revolution. They're certainly the ones who are able to, they're the ones in many ways who actually have the resources, right? So, well, and I would say you talk about significant student loans. Again, debtors are a classic revolutionary class. Creditors want to keep the system in place. Debtors. Now, what's interesting about these managerial people is I would say they're both, in a sense, they're both debtors and creditors of the system, right? They have a lot of student loan debt, but in a sense, so let's say you graduate from a school and get a top tier DEI administrator job. You might have a lot of student loan debt, but you also actually have a job that in many ways is a tax on the rest of the system and is created for you to have relatively high status in society. And the fact that the incumbent system sort of places that obligation on the company to create that job for you makes you a creditor of the system. You're continuing to benefit from the stability of the system. So I think that they're in a precarious position in the sense that many of them don't want the system to be disrupted. AI is fundamentally disruptive to it. This is why I say, so this, let's step back actually. And I'll say this is at the macro level, why I would say we should view AI and AI enabled disruptive technology generally as a friend of our movement. Disruptive technologies are the biggest threat to the incumbent regime, the incumbent system, and to the anomalies of the previous era. And I would say many of both of those, many of the anomalies of the previous year, are the types of people who have significant elite jobs in society are largely out of step with the historical norms. You would actually expect disruptive technologies to first and foremost eliminate many of the jobs and leave many of the things that have survived for a long time, which fundamentally are the things that we care about. And second of all, you would say it's going to be extremely disruptive to the sort of power position of the incumbent regime. And so, are those people potential revolutionaries? On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, that's not a great position, because so much of their relative power and status in society comes from a system, and revolution is going to be fundamentally disruptive to that. So I think that you do expect to see some of them turn toward a Mamdani style leftism or something. But even in a scenario where that takes off, I don't think it preserves the level of sort of quasi hegemonic power that they seem to hold over society for the previous decade.
I think that might be one of the most interesting riffs we've ever had on this podcast. That was awesome. I want to come back to it in a second, because I want to compare what's happening there with some of the more blue collar stuff. So there's this interview that I think is sort of era defining, and I think most people online have seen it, but or it turned into more of a debate between Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson about autonomous vehicles, right?
Yep.
Replacing semi-truck drivers and that sort of thing. So Tucker has this bit where he essentially says, I would ban it in a second. If you put all of these people out of work, they will rise up and kill you. There are millions of them, and so on and so forth. Where would you sort of align on that? Like, where would you put yourself on that spectrum between Shapiro saying like it's the free market, whatever, versus Tucker saying, we need to make sure that these people stay employed, not just because he thinks it's the right thing to do, but also because he doesn't want them to rise up and kill all of us.
So I think I would just say, I would reframe how we're thinking about that. I think that in many ways, Shapiro is sort of hand wavy about the free market. It's going to take care of itself. Tucker's obviously concerned about the American people.
Mm-hmm.
The way I would think about this is, first, this technology is going to be disruptive to disproportionately to the institutions and to the people who have been a threat to what Tucker cares about. So we should recognize that their sort of disruptive periods are disruptive, and that is going to be a challenge. We need to get through it. But as a movement and as a people, these technologies are generally going to be a friend to us, and they're going to be a threat primarily to the people that Tucker has defined himself opposing, that the populists have defined themselves opposing. Beyond that, though, I would say it's I think it's not just the free market sort of leading to efficient outcomes. Fundamentally, I think what we should realize is the American people, and this is where I believe there's a sort of this is where I actually believe that the populists have the most to gain from technology. It's not just on the negative side, it's a threat to incumbent elites, but I think the American people are uniquely suited to the mastering of technology. Fundamentally, I believe that Americans have the capabilities and the skill set. I think this applies everything from working class roles, but I think there's a lot of sort of class-based discussion here, but I would say the bigger one in many ways is geographic, right? I mean, I think the biggest threat has been this sort of concentration of power on the coast, whether in Silicon Valley or New York. In many ways, sort of decades of sort of sucking of opportunity from middle America, sucking of money. I mean, literally, private equity firms will buy companies in middle America. They'll put a lot of debt on them, and then interest payments are sort of sucked out to the coast, and there's less reinvestment there. Silicon Valley will start software. They'll sell software to it, but the software fees all go to Silicon Valley. Corresponding to that, the opportunity for career growth, the opportunity for young people. Literally, they have to sort of pick up and move to New York to actually have an opportunity in that career. That is where the elite is developing. And that, I believe, is something that can reverse. I believe that when it comes to the mastery of technology, particularly technologies like AI, the sort of people who are actually well suited to harness that technology are scattered throughout the country. They're the sort of people who are sort of sitting in these middle American industrial businesses, continually frustrated, sort of thinking there's a better way to do things. That's a very American mindset. And we should recognize that, yes, these technologies will be disruptive, But by and large, the people who are actually driving this disruption, even when it comes to things like autonomy, it's not just going to sort of be driven by an algorithm. It's not going to be like Uber, I don't think, where it's driven by an algorithm from San Francisco. The economy is more complicated than that. The practical application will be something that requires sort of innovative application by people who are scattered throughout the country. So I think that if we recognize that this technology, what actually enables America to be dynamic, what will actually allow this technology to be transformative, will not just be a few elites and cognitive elites in Silicon Valley, the best and the brightest from around the world, which I think is a pervasive mindset that even Ben Shapiro might say that's probably going to happen. And maybe it's for the best. It's more efficient for everyone, right? I would say what certainly a lot of people in Silicon Valley who, let's say, would be on the sort of positive side of that H-1B, that immigration debate, just think we just need the best and the brightest there. But I actually think that what needs to be recognized, what both sides should recognize is it is actually this particular culture, this particular people, this heritage that actually ties into things like Taming of the West and that comfort with chaos that actually makes Americans suited to mastering this technology and means that a successful rollout of this technology will actually require these conditions, not just the innovation of the technology.
Yeah, but I want to push you back into the framework of the question that I'm asking.
Yeah.
Just in and again, I'm going to like way overly simplify it, but I mean, I have a Tesla. You can just hit the button for full self-driving and it can do 100 miles and you don't even have to touch it. Like the technology is here now, or we're very close to it actually not needing like an ass in a seat, for lack of a better word. And that actually has the ability to replace these people. So I get everything that you're saying in a political and philosophical sense, but this big disruption to people, by the way, who primarily vote for us is very real. And so can you address like that specific piece of it a little more?
So I think that specific. So I guess, yes, those sorts of disruptions will be complicated disruptions that we need to work out.
Yeah.
What I would say is, as a movement, we should recognize that these technologies are generally sort of friends of ours, and they will structurally advantage our movement. Then the question becomes how, within that coalition, we work out these disruptions, how we manage retraining, how we manage things like that. And I would say if we recognize that they're structurally friendly to our movement and to our people, you want your bias to be in favor of embracing it.
I agree.
What it looks like in terms of how the specific disruptions are disruptive, and they're going to be disruptive to both sides, right? They're going to be, I think, much more disruptive to the other side. Certainly, they're going to be disruptive to their sort of the relative position they've held in society for the last few decades, particularly really for more than the last half century. But they're going to be disruptive to a lot of people on our side. The truck drivers, as an example. Now, I tend to be skeptical that those things actually move as quickly as I think that the doom scenario suggests. I think that in practice, people, they were talking about, I think, truckers being replaced a decade ago, and I think that now they talk about a shortage of truckers. Enough of the shortage that apparently we need lots of H-1B truckers or whatever.
Yeah.
So practically speaking, I'm not so worried about the doom scenario, but I think that if our coalition recognizes these disruptions are going to be friendly to us, part of the job of a political coalition is to make sure that those disruptions are managed in a way that is particularly smoothed out or particularly focused on alleviating the concerns of particular constituencies within that coalition who may face more of the brunt of that.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, I think the other thing is like Silicon Valley has a incentive to push sort of extreme scenarios of AI massively disrupting things. Again, going back to the sort of practical application, the practical application is a lot messier. I would say the application of these technologies to trucking, as an example, is something that is, yes, there's going to be algorithms that change a lot of things, but a lot of the actual application is going to rely on people who probably come up within that trucking business, in many cases who have been in the industry for a long time, in many cases who may have been doing exactly the sort of work that is supposedly threatened by it, and they'll actually be positioned to play a significant role in a lot of the transition state. So I think that, again, going to that sort of mastering of technology. Like what these truckers do is a very complex job. They're not just turning the steering wheel. They're doing a tremendous array of things. And yes, the steering wheel portion may be replaced by an algorithm, but there is a tremendous number of other things that are not going to be replaced by an algorithm. And in fact, their ability to master those algorithms, their ability to be among the people who are mastering that technology will actually could lead to significant productivity increases. So I think that we want to be optimistic about the potential for sort of a broad-based mastery of this technology and gaining of the value of this technology, while recognizing that there are going to be political concerns around it that should be managed.
Yeah, I know that my last question might have seemed a little pedantic, but the reason why I wanted to get into that was to lead up to this question, which I think is the pinnacle, which is, should we treat those guys who I would term as our guys, right?
Yes.
The guys that we want to do patronage for, the guys that we want to support, differently than we treat those of the managerial class that are being replaced, who are, again, generalizing, usually not our guys.
Without question. That is simple politics. But I would say, I would actually say that it actually goes more broadly. What's interesting is you talk about those guys as our guys. My pitch, and this is in some way sort of my pitch to the tech elites, to what I would say are they're not just sort of would be members of the coalition. They're would be American elites, right? If they are going to, in a sense, be allowed to retain that power, people aren't going to rise up with pitchforks and overthrow them, right? They need to be sort of accepted as legitimate elites. And so I think that it shouldn't just be a matter of we see those guys as our guys and we sort of force the tech guys to give them some concessions, but more like the tech guys should recognize most of those people as their guys. They should recognize that sort of that broad base of the American people, ranging from working class roles up to a wide array of sort of operational roles, the sort of people who staff these businesses are their people. Those are the people who have both created the political conditions, created and preserved the political conditions, but also the cultural conditions to actually harness these new technologies. So instead of trying to spend all their time trying to think about how we can replace that person, it's better off if they actually realize those people have particular capabilities beyond, in many cases, what peers in sort of other countries have. Like there is an American cultural attribute that is sort of present across those groups that actually means that those people are the best people to possibly be working with as you think about innovating and applying these technologies across these industries. So what you need is a role where the tech elites themselves actually see themselves not just as sort of elites on behalf of tech pursuing a tech vision, but they see themselves as elites who are recognizing that role as representatives of this broader society and embracing the fact that they are helping spearhead and steward new technologies that should be developed in a way that are both leveraging the capabilities of and advancing the interests of this broad group of people.
I 100% agree with you. That is great stuff. I know that there is going to be a lot of interest after this podcast comes out from the people that listen in what you're talking about and the way that you think about all of these things. Where can people find you and keep up with everything that New Founding is doing?
So first and foremost, very active on X. That's sort of been our flag from the beginning, and I would say it's me, and I would say it's a lot of other people on the New Founding team as well.
You don't have an account on Blue Sky?
Yes. Friend enemy distinction when it comes to platform selection, right?
Yeah.
So X is a very significant one. I will be talking about this a lot more. I would say this is something that in many ways the last few years have been a sort of heads down building a number of these businesses. I think the question really is emerging. I would say the pressing question of this upcoming year and more is this question of what the synthesis can look like. Is there a positive sum vision? And I would say fundamentally, that's an entrepreneurial problem, right? I mean, what I just described, many people could say that's very hand wavy, right? They'll retrain, they'll figure things out, right? Is that something that doesn't actually happen? What does that actually concretely look like? And I think that's an entrepreneurial problem. It's a problem that needs to be developed It's at the intersection of that sort of technology, entrepreneurship, and statesmanship. And that is something that I will be spending a lot of time focused on over the next year, working out concretely, as I talked about, buying these middle market industrial businesses and actually figuring out how to steward their transformation. That is a question where we actually work out what does that look like concretely within many of these businesses. So I'll be talking about that at X. I'll be talking about that, I'm sure, in some other conversations and some written pieces that come out in the next few months. And then fundamentally, I've been spending a lot more time in DC. So I think that coming to actually be talking to groups of people who are thinking about this in different contexts is going to be a growing priority.
That's great. All very good. Well, thank you.
Dallas. And finally, we're based in Dallas. I mean, we geographically put ourselves in a position where we are sort of culturally and geographically closer to the middle of America, which I think is which I believe will become a growing center of innovation, right? As sort of the last years were defined by, let's say, finance driving transformation from Wall Street, government from DC, tech from Silicon Valley. I actually believe this sort of next era, this question of the application of technology will be much, much more distributed throughout the country. And we've placed ourselves in a place where we're geographically and culturally proximate to that. So we love to see people in Dallas. We're actually building more and more of a hub there. And so I think that actually being close to that action, so to speak, is something that's important. And we'd love to see people there.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on Moment of Truth once again.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to yet another fantastic episode of Moment of Truth. And thank you to Nate Fischer for making the time to come here to chilly Washington, D.C., all the way from Dallas, Texas. We really appreciate it. And we always got to provide good content to our audience. So thank you guys very much for listening, for being fans of American Moment. And we will see you again next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier and Hunter Smith, with original graphics and title cards by Jared Cummings. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is AmericanMoment.org.